As millions of Americans debate whether to roll up their sleeve for the COVID vaccine, manufacturers are trying to build trust.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, we all know, though, that over the long term, the best solution to this crisis would be a vaccine.
First, researchers need to develop a candidate vaccine. This can take years. Vaccines kickstart the immune system by teaching our bodies to recognize the virus.
The Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program was created to cover damage caused by treatments for pandemics and security threats, such as H1N1.
Well, I think that rather than having this extreme polarization, we just need to be able to talk.
Here in LA, there are schools in which 20% of the students aren't vaccinated because parents here are more scared of gluten than they are of smallpox.
Tech companies are actually starting to fight anti-vaccination propaganda.
The Greater Good is a documentary challenging the scientific consensus that vaccines are safe. It's one of at least 5 films that Amazon apparently pulled from its popular streaming video service.
Because there's all these anti-vaxxers now, isn't it?
Well, Marina can tell you a little bit about how we've achieved that.
Marina, what do you think of anti-vaxxers?
Well, yes, we've changed a lot of our practices.
Contrary to popular belief and conventional wisdom, which says that vaccines are proven safe and effective, I haven't been able to find where they have been proven either safe or effective. And I think that there's a lot of research that needs to be done still.
These are the raw materials for a COVID-19 vaccine. Bags full of biological cells, soon to have an inactivated or dead virus added to them.
My doctor, who I love and admire, says to me every year, come October, you must get the flu vaccine. You must get the vaccine against pneumonia. I listen to my doctor, who I love and admire, who's been taking care of me for years. Should I instead listen to you and not take the flu vaccine?
I think people should hear both sides of the story. It should be out there, both sides of the story, and let people make their own mind up.
Bill Gates Foundation is funding factories for 7 candidate vaccines.
President Trump says he is very confident there will be a coronavirus vaccine by the end of the year.
The first vaccinations actually happened back in the 1400s in China, and that they did a better type of vaccine than what we actually ended up with the smallpox vaccine. What they did was they took scabs off of people who actually had smallpox. They crushed the scabs, and then they insufflated them or blew them up people's noses, which was a more likely way that if you were going to contract smallpox, it would be through inhaling the virus. They actually had clinics in China where people would go days ahead of time, and they would get prepared for this vaccination process. They would eat right, they would rest, they would take care of it themselves, and then after they were vaccinated, they were to rest and have like nursing type of care for several days. And some people then did develop a natural type of immunity because the virus went into the body in a more natural way through the nasal passages and developed an immune response to the virus that ended up in their lungs and then into their bloodstream. However, it didn't always work so well because sometimes if you got a very large dose of very active and virulent virus that came off of that scab, you died.
So I think the first time that we think about a vaccine, and actually it was called a vaccine, was back with Edward Jenner and using cowpox to inoculate people against smallpox. And it's very different from vaccines today because what he did was saw there's a similarity between cowpox and smallpox. And smallpox is essentially just having a skin rash with lesions that leave a scar, along with fever and other kind of constitutional symptoms. And that's pretty much what smallpox is. But it had some degree of mortality associated with it, whereas cowpox seemed to be less severe among the cow or the bovine population.
Calves are the source of smallpox vaccine. Cattle are subject to a weakened form of smallpox called cowpox.
So this idea was basically really kind of based in homeopathic theory, because it was like giving a less severe form of the infection to try and protect against a more severe form of the infection.
Vaccines are supposed to work by injecting an attenuated or weakened virus or a small part of a cell wall of a bacteria into the muscle, which then is picked up by macrophages and other types of white blood cells and carried into the bloodstream. And the idea is to create an antibody, which the industry calls it a protective antibody, which it really doesn't protect, because you can have very high levels of antibodies and still contract the infection for which you've been vaccinated against.
The process of a vaccination is with the premise that we are going to create a level of functioning of the immune system that would supersede what is normal physiologically available to a newborn baby when they're born. So the entire premise is based upon increasing the intensity of the immune system to protect the baby or to protect the newborn from a potential disease process that is supposedly higher likelihood that they would acquire that disease process were they not to get inoculated with the vaccine.
And so they would take the pus from cowpox lesions, right, on the cows, and then make a small incision in the skin of a person and put the pus into the open wound. And that was essentially the strategy to try and prevent or eliminate smallpox. And that's where the name vaccine comes from, because it's from the root vacca, and I think it's Latin, means cow. So that's what the vaccine is, but where the name comes from. But later on, with a more modern vaccine, they decided to keep the name sort of to honor Jenner, but it was a different technology or a different approach based on a different theory, the theory of immunity.
So when you ask the question, how is a vaccine supposed to work? A vaccine is supposed to work to increase the immune response, the natural innate immune response that the body inherently has.
Then in the early 1700s, they started doing a vaccination by taking small amounts of the pus off of someone who actually had the infection and injecting it in the webs between their fingers. And it was done primarily because smallpox, the virus, has a predilection for the oil glands in the face.
During the era where there were compulsory vaccinations, according to that strategy in France, there were a major excess of deaths of smallpox compared to when the vaccine was taken out of widespread use. So already, like with the first strategy, really, there was a big kind of cover-up of this information, and in the history books, you know, Jenner is seen as a hero of inventing this life-saving technology, but that's not really what happened in the populations.
In terms of vaccinations, I always thought that vaccinations were the best thing since sliced bread, because I was always taught that there were all these diseases from which people used to die, and then the vaccines came along and they stopped dying. And this is at medical school, and school before that. And then there were also other diseases from which people used to die, but then we had better sanitation, so we were told that was due to sanitation. And as medical students are supposed to be a bit bright, you think that we might say, well, if this was due to sanitation, how do we know it all wasn't due to sanitation? But there's so much to learn on the medical school curriculum that we just learn vaccine preventable, sanitation preventable, and all the graphs show that from when vaccination came in, all the cases or deaths all came straight down.
In terms of smallpox being eradicated related to the vaccine later on, because now we're at the point where we don't even have smallpox vaccines, right? Because the disease has essentially been considered eradicated. But if you look back earlier than that, during periods where there were mandatory vaccines for smallpox versus periods when there weren't, you actually see there were many more cases and many more deaths during times when vaccines were mandated.
Missionaries went around the world with dried smallpox powder and started vaccinating people in America and in South America and in the Indian population. And the problem with that was that many people that they had scraped that pustule and that scab off of their arms, those human beings had syphilis, unbeknownst to them. So when they took those scabs off of the humans and took them around the world, they were actually started spreading syphilis to Indian cultures in South America and in the Americas. So not only were they making a mess of the immune system, they found that if you had been cowpoxed, you could still contract smallpox. And during that period of time, the smallpox virus that was in circulation was much, much more virulent. And over time, because of endemic exposure and by spreading this around and having people be exposed more and more, people developed almost a herd immunity to smallpox, and the virulence started going down. That in the 1920s here in the United States, we never saw cases of smallpox smallpox major, which was called variola. We would only see smallpox minor, which was just a couple of bumps here and there. And the last official case of smallpox seen in the U.S. was in the 1940s in Texas.
Now, polio is another interesting story, and one that is, I think, near and dear to the hearts of many people in the baby boomer generation, especially because when they were children, they witnessed other children being sick or getting paralyzed, and it was something, they were scared about, for certain.
This gasping tank even does your breathing, a job you've done yourself instinctively since the moment of birth. But now, there's not one thing you can do for yourself except blink and let your heart beat.
So if you look closely at what happened there, what you see is essentially that it was a new disease that what didn't exist before the 1800s, or maybe it was discovered just before the 1800s. So if you look back in historical textbooks, there were no examples of sudden paralysis among children. And by the way, the name poliomyelitis actually is not the name of a virus. It's the name of the condition that causes paralysis. And what it refers to is that the spinal cord has a certain type of lesion, and it's in the front part called the anterior horn. And that basically confers motor paralysis, or you get loss of movement, but not sensation, to the affected part of the body.
Back in the 1920s, 1930s, prior to the end of World War II, so in that 1920s to 1940s time frame, there were many different chemicals that were introduced into the global economy, and there are specifically 12 different compounds that are now considered by the global community as carcinogenic, as very dangerous, and not to be used. They're basically considered unsafe, and they've been prohibited throughout the planet. But what's interesting is that each one of these dirty dozen, they refer to as the dirty dozen, these 12 compounds, each one of these compounds was used for a minimum of 50 years prior to being recognized how dangerous and how destructive they were. Some of them over 75 years. One of those compounds was a compound called DDT.
But what happened is that these were kind of sporadic cases, and then in the early 1900s they started increasing. But this seems to be most likely due to the uptick in the use of environmental pesticides, or it was actually a new thing because the chemical industry was expanding.
They are advertisements in the newspapers and magazines in the US that go back 60, 70, 80 years that show children or babies sitting with a smile on their face with their diapers on and a caption above them saying, "Flies don't land on me because I've had my DDT."
there were like children playing on the street, and the trucks would come by spraying DDT, and the children were encouraged to actually go in the spray, right, to rid themselves of disease-carrying insects or, you know, that kind of thing.
Now, if you take the graph of the incidence of polio and you put it, you graph it out over a period of time, and let's say from the turn of the century till, say, the eradication of polio, and then you also take a graph and see the incidence of the usage of DDT, you will find a very interesting correlation. Both graphs are virtually the same. They're identical. There's obviously some subtle fluctuations, but the peaks and the troughs essentially look the same. Now, they're not at the same time. They're actually juxtaposed by about 6 months, maybe 8 months.
And so you can see that really most likely these are the cause of polio, and that there was this separate hunt for a virus that, you know, really has never been clearly found. But they didn't really look at, well, is there an environmental cause? And why did polio come on the rise so quickly?
I would say that the industry is built on the back of what they call eradicationism, that they feel like they eradicated smallpox using the vaccine, which they didn't. It was estimated in the 1940s and 50s and even into the 70s that less than 70% of the global population was actually vaccinated. It went away with hygiene, and the virus, just as they say in the literature, burned itself out. But it starts from that, and that was about the same time. That was in 1972, and remember the height of the polio epidemic, and when they released the polio vaccine was in 1954, 1955. So they were like, well, if we could eliminate smallpox and we can eradicate polio, then if we made enough vaccines, we could eradicate all these other pathogens. And almost every single conversation, when you start with someone who knows nothing about the vaccine industry and nothing about the truth about the harm that vaccines cause, the conversation almost always starts with, well, what about smallpox and what about polio?
And they had already come down basically, you know, more than 3/4 of the way if you look at like the polio deaths when the vaccine first came on the market. And the Salk vaccine was the first one that was injected, and there were a lot of problems with that, including it causing cases of polio. So then the Sabin vaccine came out a few years later, but once the Sabin vaccine was in widespread use, there were practically no deaths from polio already.
So I believe that that's true, that if that piece of information either was more clearly understood or was just removed from the discussion and people actually saw all these different vaccines and what the ingredients were in them, the industry would just fall apart.
So you can see how this story was, at the time, perhaps, you know, people were genuine in that thought it was really a viral issue, and they thought that the vaccine was responsible for reducing this disease. But now, you know, there's plenty of evidence from the historical record, the epidemiologic record, the scientific record to show that really there's no evidence that there was a virus or that caused that paralysis, and no evidence that the vaccines were responsible for eradicating that disease.
Well, I think that parents obviously want to do the best thing for their child. And I believe that the people that are in medicine, they also want to do the best thing for the child. I don't think that anyone at the actual functional levels where they're interacting with the patients and with these children, I don't think that they have evil intentions. I think all of those people want the best for the child. But I think that there's been a lot of information, a lot of disinformation that's been put out. There's a lot of marketing that takes place to doctors by pharmaceutical companies and so on. And doctors learn what the pharmaceutical companies are pushing and what they're teaching. And so what they believe is generally speaking what they are desired to believe by big pharma, and that is that these vaccines are safe and effective and they're healthy and kids need these and so on. That's what they all believe.
The immune system in a newborn baby is not fully developed till at least 6 months of age, but most immunologists will say anywhere from a year to 2 years before it's fully matured. And some immunologists will even go on to say up to the first 10 years or 12 years of life, it's not fully matured. So we know that the immune system is not even capable of seroconverting and creating an antibody response till a minimum of 6 months of age. So by that fact alone, why are we giving newborn babies on the first day on the planet substances that are supposed to create immunity when it's impossible because the immune system isn't even capable of creating a seroconversion? It's not capable of mounting a response. That's the first issue.
I'm Amanda, and I live with Ian. Now, back in 2007, we moved out of London into Kent. Not necessarily to start a family, but after a few months of living there, I fell pregnant, and yeah, we were to have our first child together. Now, I didn't have so much of a social circle around me of friends with children, so I was never really into that sort of scene. So yeah, we just sort of, you know, just took every step as it came. I had an amazing pregnancy, and Alfie was born on the 14th of September.
The psychological situation, I think, is very difficult for someone who is who's a new parent. Most new parents are naive about these kinds of things and haven't had the time to study all of this. And the problem is it's such a polarized topic of discussion now that people are either pro-vaccine or they're anti-vaccine, and people that are anti-vaccine are, of course, vilified all over the world. But there's a lot of money behind that, so you have to question what's really going on there.
Then we had the visits from the health visitor talking about vaccinations. The vaccinations, I hadn't really given them much thought. I'd always associated them and grown up with hearing that vaccinations, heal great diseases, and we were all a lot better off for these life-saving vaccines. So I didn't really give it any other thought, and we vaccinated as per the schedule. And I can remember at the time that there was no major problems with Alfie after his first lot of vaccines and his second. A little bit miserable, a little bit under the weather, but we were told that that was perfectly normal. And then at the age of 14 months, that was the time to get the MMR. And I wasn't too comfortable with the MMR because there was a lot of controversy around the MMR vaccine and the association that it was causing autism, or suspected to be causing autism. And yeah, it just felt a little bit worried about that one.
Well, I think that we're raised, at least in the West, to believe that doctors have our best interests at heart, and they have all the training that we don't have, and to think that a doctor would violate their Hippocratic Oath, which says, first of all, do no harm, is something that we can't really, I think, quite imagine. I think that the fact is that we're not exposed to the negative side of vaccinations, although there is a lot of research. Contrary to popular belief, there's lots of research out there.
But when you go online and read about measles, mumps and rubella, and you're reading the stuff and they're telling you how dangerous actually them diseases can be, it sort of puts you into a fear, into a state of fear.
The mothers know, for example, of these kids who are autistic, who know that their child was perfectly normal until that child received those vaccinations. Those mothers know that they know the truth about it.
I didn't take Alfie to get that vaccination. It was our mother-in-law, and she said that the doctor had said to her, or the nurse had said to her, that around the 10-day mark, Alfie will start to feel might feel a bit poorly, as that's when the live part of the measles vaccine kicks in. And yeah, around about day 8, Alfie started to get angry. I'd never seen him display them feelings of anger, and there was nothing for him to be angry about. It was a frustration, and I even took photographs of it because I found it quite strange.
Well, you know, you can tell when you discuss this issue with people that there is such a visceral, like, trigger emotional reaction that they have, right? And it's, you know, how dare you threaten the health of my child by not vaccinating your child, for example. You know, it's much easier to just accept what most people are saying, especially, you know, the authority figures. You know, we're also conditioned to trust authority. And when we see, you know, those 3 letters, CDC, we think that, you know, that's like our grandpa coming to make sure we're safe, you know, and tuck us in. And it's hard to look at it otherwise. It's hard to look at the truth of this because you'd have to go against so much, and you'd have to realize that those whom you entrusted, even with the welfare of your own children, have not been honest with you.
And then he was really poorly. He started, and on day 10 I'd gone to work, and Ian had called me at work and said that, Amanda, he's not right, he's not eating, he's sleeping, he's not 100% at all. And I said, well, let's phone the doctor. So the doctor said it's perfectly normal, it's day 10, he's had his MMR vaccine, give him some Calpol, and if he's still not right tomorrow, we'll see him. So he'd had a low-grade temperature at that point, and we gave him a very tepid bath, tried to feed him some milk, and he wasn't really interested. So we fed him 5 ml of Calpol and put him down to bed, and we went downstairs. We had the monitor on in the room as well. We went downstairs, we had some tea, and I'd finished eating tea, and it must have been about half an hour, 40 minutes. And I said, I'm just going to go and check on Alfie. And when I got upstairs to his room, he was face down, and he was sort of all cuddled up in the corner of the cot. So I felt the back of his neck to see if he was hot or if his temperature was rising or anything like that. And he felt, the temperature just didn't feel right. And as I turned him over, I realised that he'd gone. His lips were blue, his fingertips were blue. And I panicked, and I picked him up, and I screamed, and I ran down the stairs, and I didn't know what to do, and I was screaming for Ian to go and call my neighbour who's a paramedic. And she was at work, so we then dialed 999. I'm trying to administer CPR on him, all the while the ambulance service were on the phone telling me exactly what to do. And even as I was doing it, I knew he'd gone. I knew it was fruitless. I could hear the rattling as I was giving him his CPR, and I knew he wasn't going to come back. And it took them at the hospital about 20 minutes to come and pronounce him officially dead. And the first thing I can remember saying, it was a vaccine, wasn't it? It was the MMR. And the consultant, Dr. Day, stood there and looked at me, and he said, we're going to have to find out. We don't know at this stage. And I said, it's the vaccine. It's day 10. He feels unwell. I said, there's nothing else wrong with him. I just couldn't understand, and I could see the nurses that had been working on him, and I could see the look in their face. I'll never forget it, as if this was not the first time they'd seen this.
There's so much money in the pharmaceutical complex, you might call it, that is geared toward moving people down one funnel, and that is to get vaccinated, and there's lots of money in that, and the common conventional wisdom is that that's healthy for you and it's good for you, and but I think it's all been built on this false premise that it was vaccines that got rid of all of these childhood diseases in the first place. But if you go back and you look at the statistics, most of those diseases were almost entirely out of the population already when these vaccines were introduced.
They said that they had to report it to the police. So when we got home, we had to wait for the police to arrive. And we had 2 officers turn up who told us that we weren't allowed to leave the living room, that they had to go upstairs to Alfie's room and take his bed in, his teddy bear. They grilled us on what we'd fed him, what medication we'd give him. They took him the Calpol. They took the Calpol that we'd administered, and questioned us like we'd killed him. And it took them until, they didn't leave our house until about 1 o'clock in the morning. And then they just got up, walked out, and just left Ian and I. 1 o'clock in the morning in our house, where 6 hours previously we were a family, and no, we weren't any longer. I can't really remember what happened for the rest of that night. I don't even know if I called my mum that night or whether I did it in the morning. But I can remember getting the computer and sitting there, and I googled MMR deaths, and the first thing that came up in the search was 24 cases of death recorded in the UK from the MMR vaccine. And I was like, why haven't I heard about this? Nobody told me about this. I'd always sort of, the fear that I'd initially had was the MMR was, was being accused of causing autism. At no point had anyone said to me, there is a risk of death from this vaccine.
I think that, unfortunately, the age that we're living in now is an age where if you want to know the truth about something, you can't expect to just receive it on a silver platter. If you want the truth about almost anything, you have to dig. And I think we're living in an age of propaganda where there's more propaganda going on now than there ever used to be, ever at any time in history.
As of tonight, at least 114 cases of measles have been reported in 14 states. Today, the president said through a spokesman that science indicates children should be vaccinated.
And so we're all being fed this propaganda all the time. And so I think that there's a possibility that vaccination may, in some circumstances, be safe and effective. I don't know. I haven't been able to find that out. I haven't seen any research to that effect. On the other hand, there's a lot of research that says that there are definitely issues.
So I didn't really know what to do. I was quite shell-shocked. We were waiting for the autopsy results to come back from the hospital. And we hadn't heard anything for 48 hours. So I called the hospital, I called the coroner, said, have you got any news on the cause of my son's death? And he said, well, the report's not finished, but initial findings are showing us that he had an enlarged heart. So I thought, oh, so maybe it wasn't the vaccine. Maybe he had an underlying heart condition that none of us knew about. And then I think it was about a week later, we got the coroner's report, and the consultant at the hospital offered to come round and explain the terminology within it. And we went through the whole of the coroner's report. Not one mention of an enlarged heart at all. His heart was perfectly healthy, it was the perfect size. They had done all of that, and what they had suggested that there was a swelling on the brain, and I'm just trying to remember that in the autopsy report it said something about this not being associated with the MMR vaccine or something, and or it's a systematic thing that happens after the MMR. And I said, well, how do you know that? How do these people know that? How many dead babies have they done an autopsy on for them to tell me that this is a symptomatic cause or symptom of a vaccine? The consultant said, I'm not too sure, but it's a very, very good question that you ask. He said, I'm going to go away and find out for you. Never heard from him since. Never.
Here's the issue. Some of these substances, these adjuvants, these preservatives, like mercury and nickel and some of these substances, they are naturally eliminated through the alimentary system, through the gastrointestinal system. But now we're giving this on the first day of the planet, and the gastrointestinal system in children is not fully developed till the first year of life. So the natural way of detoxifying some of these substances, were they to be exposed to naturally, would not be feasible for the system to eliminate, because the system's elimination metabolic processes are not fully developed till the first year of life. So now we're giving substances that we know, like formaldehyde, like nickel, like mercury, that are eliminated through the gastrointestinal system, and it's not fully developed till the first year of life. So you see, there's a lot of developmental aspects: seroconversion, the immune system, the alimentary system, the gastrointestinal system, etc.
I wanted to find out whether it was a hot lot. I'd never known that there was any such thing as a hot lot, that sometimes they have vaccines that are not quite nice and can be worse than they normally are. So they spread them out, but you have to record the lot numbers. I wrote to the pharmaceutical company who produced the vaccine, and they said there'd been no other reports of any issues with the lot number of that vaccine that my son was administered. I then wrote to my local MP, and the response that I got from him was really poor, if I'm being honest. No, nobody was interested at all. It was as if it was trying to be brushed underneath the carpet. No one really wanted to know.
Well, I think that would be a very difficult thing to deal with. If you have a child and you're following the conventional wisdom, you get that child vaccinated, and then that child becomes vaccine damaged, I think that not only would it be a very, very difficult situation for you to deal with, just having that vaccine damaged child, but also the guilt that you would feel for not knowing better. But I mean, I think that so much of the time people shouldn't blame themselves, because they're just flowing along in the system that has problems, and they become the result of that.
We set up the JABS group back in January '94 because of our youngest son's severe experience with an MMR vaccination. When he was 13 months old, we'd been told that he was due for MMR and Hib, and because our older two boys hadn't had those vaccines, I wanted to know more about them. So the health visitor came out to answer my questions. What I didn't appreciate at the time was she was answering my questions from the Health Protection Agency's leaflet rather than the drug manufacturer's product sheets.
In 1998, Dr. Andy Wakefield published a paper that said that perhaps measles virus from vaccines was causing something called ileolymphoid hyperplasia, which is swollen lymph nodes inside of the GI tract. And the conclusion of that paper was, perhaps we should look at this more closely. It didn't say that vaccine strain measles was causing any sort of inflammation in the gut. There was never a correlation between vaccines and the MMR and autism in that original paper ever made. And when people use that argument off of a 20-year-old retracted paper, do you think that maybe there's been some more research that's been done since that time to show a connection between brain inflammation and measles virus, or between brain inflammation and any of the other 17 vaccines that are currently on the market?
So when I'd asked how long had the vaccine been used for, she answered it from the leaflet saying it had been used for 25 years in America, and the most I could expect would be a slight rash, slight temperature, or a bit of swelling due to the mumps component, and the diseases were deadly.
The only one that is ever correlated with autism is MMR. The only rebuttal that they have is that paper was retracted in 1998. Well, last time I looked, that was 22 years ago. And if that's your only argument against vaccines not causing autism, you know nothing about the industry and you've never observed a vaccine injury that suddenly the child's brain changes and stops working so well, which is encephalopathy, or gets even worse and has a seizure disorder, any other type of neurological things, loss of language, loss of hearing, loss of vision, which is encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain.
10 days after the vaccine was given, Robert had a huge seizure and we were rushed to the local hospital. At the hospital, I immediately raised that we'd been warned he might have a slight reaction, and this was the 10th day, the exact time frame we'd been told a slight reaction might occur. But the consultant immediately dismissed it, actually shrugging his shoulders and saying it won't be anything to do with that.
And basically no one really knows what the adverse outcomes of vaccines are, because since we've had international universal vaccination since the 1960s, nobody has systematically, openly and methodically actually charted all these adverse reactions. If they had, by now we'd have a massive database, we could look at patterns, we could say this is definitely not associated, this is, but we haven't got that.
I often find the argument or even the discussion about vaccines not causing autism, quite frankly, I find it irritating, because it tells me that the people who ask the question know nothing about the industry, nothing.
But unfortunately, from then on, Robert's life changed. Over the coming months, he developed more and more seizures. He developed a problem with his immune system, which we were told was an acquired immune deficiency. He started to regress and lose all the skills that he'd already acquired, and we couldn't get a proper medical diagnosis for him. We were eventually told that all these problems were just a coincidence. They'd all happened at that one particular point in his life, and that was something that seemed absolutely incredible. So we started to research the subject, and for the first time I got hold of the drug company's patient information leaflets. It was a huge culture shock to find that the symptoms he'd had and the long-term problems he was suffering from were listed in the product sheet as rare events. They don't know that at 28 years of age, he's still like a 14-month-old mentally, wheelchair-bound, severe epilepsy, can't walk or talk, and needs 24-hour care for the rest of his life. And if they've missed it with Robert, they've missed it with many more. Subsequently, we were meeting other parents in the waiting rooms before going in to see the neurologist, who were also saying that their children had been fine up to MMR being given, and now their child had got behavioural problems, development problems, epilepsy, severe neurological issues. So we, at that time, took it to our community health council, who said that we should organise an open meeting, which we did at Wigan Town Hall. So we held a meeting there and 150 people attended. And they too, many of them were saying that their children had been found to have problems after the MMR, and that's when we launched the group.
I have a personal collection of over 12,000 links to articles, full-text articles, abstracts, and partial articles only from peer-reviewed medical literature, not from conspiratology.com, not from blogs, but from mainstream medical literature showing problems associated with vaccines. And among those problems include asthma, allergies, eczema, ADD, ADHD, a long list of psychiatric problems, a long list of neurological problems such as Guillain-Barré syndrome, headaches, depression, anxiety, panic attacks, a long list of cardiovascular things like arrhythmias and cardiac, other types of cardiac problems, a very long list of autoimmune diseases such as Sjogren's syndrome, hair loss and alopecia, lupus. The list is very long of the number of types of side effects and conditions that can be caused from the vaccines and the combination of vaccines that are given and the ingredients within the vaccines.
You know, I'm often asked about the safety of vaccines, and my comment is that vaccines are very safe as long as they stay in a bottle and are not injected into people. The key is that it creates excitotoxicity of the brain and it doesn't shut down. That's why these kids are bouncing off the walls. You know, coupled with, you know, low thyroids from all the poor diet and the heavy metals and the adjuvants that are added into the vaccines. You would think some witch made up this brew. There's formaldehyde in there, polysorbital 80, peanut oil, fetal tissue. You know, it's just unconscionable what they're injecting into these young kids.
It was very difficult because although we were raising vaccine damage with doctors, we were never told by anyone in the medical profession that firstly the Department of Works and Pensions had got a vaccine damage payment unit, a branch of called the Vaccine Damage Unit, and had been set up because children had been brain damaged by the whooping cough jab in the 70s and the smallpox and polio vaccines, and an Act of Parliament had been passed.
A vaccine injury court is a court that has been set up to address the grievances of parents who have been victims and whose children have been victims of vaccine injury. And it's in the billions the vaccine injury courts have paid out. And I think that the vast majority of people don't even know the vaccine courts exist. And also, when a parent will voice to a doctor that I think my child had this problem after the vaccine, the doctors will, the vast majority of times, 99% of the time, the doctor will say, no, no, that's not what it was.
You can have politicians, Department of Health bodies saying, look how safe our vaccines are because we make so few payments. But it's because the system is loaded against the family. But even so, over £74 million has been paid out to UK families whose children have died or suffered long-term brain damage. In the US, they've paid out over $4 billion.
So I'm George Fisher's mum, who died 18 months after his MMR vaccine. He was my fourth child, all completely vaccinated. Listened to the doctors, you know, told us everything was fine. Didn't question it, actually. We didn't even question them. We just took the kids and had their back. They were called from. We just took them. Didn't question it. Didn't ask any questions. Didn't do any research into it. And took George. He was the same as the other three children. We just took him. The nurse asked us if he was healthy, you know, if everything was okay, and I said, he's not showing signs of any ill health, cold, cough or anything. He was at his most healthiest of me, you know, I could see. So she did ask that. And gave him his MMR, left as normal.
What's happening in the United States, and this has been known about for a long time, is that the drug companies exert undue influence on individual doctors. Doctors are wined and dined by pharmaceutical reps. They are oftentimes entered into contests. Whichever doctor prescribes the most of this new drug that's come out will get some kind of an award or a trip to Hawaii for 2 or something like that. This happens all the time. So there's an element of corruption that is involved here that really needs to change, and more light needs to be put on this, I think.
As a couple of days went on, he started office food. He was still playing a lot. He wasn't lethargic in any way. He was still playing. He was playing football with my husband the night he died in the front room. Wasn't showing any signs of illness at all. The only thing he showed was office food.
In the early 1980s, there were more and more lawsuits that were being filed against the vaccine manufacturers for the whole cell pertussis vaccine, because they knew that the whole cell pertussis vaccine was causing brain damage, severe brain damage, and many of the children died. And as they started filing more and more lawsuits, the vaccine manufacturers went to government and said, hey, we believe that the whole vaccine program is the cornerstone of the public health here, and if you don't protect us and give us protection from these lawsuits, we're just going to fold up our tent and stop making vaccines.
The night he went to bed, of the night he died, and he went to bed, he fell asleep. Chris was reading, my husband Chris was reading Megan a story in the bedroom, and he fell asleep drinking his bottle, and then he just sat up in his cot, just threw his bottle up, and I went up there, cleaned him all up, and he went to run off and play like he was. He didn't show still any signs of ill health, and changed his clothes, changed his bedding, put him back to bed with a bottle of water, and he fell back to sleep. And I went up there about 11:30, and he was talking in his cot. Put my head in. He'd thrown I'd given him another bottle of water, I think. And when I was in bed, I heard him throw that out of his cot, and he was moving around, getting comfortable. I fell asleep, and I got up at 8. Megan was calling me at the stair gate, so I got up and lifted her over the stair gate, and then thought, oh, why isn't George awake?
In 1986, they passed the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Compensation Act, so that any vaccine that was on the pediatric schedule was given complete liability protection if a child experienced a severe reaction.
George should have been awake, so I went into his room and found out that he died that night, and obviously called 999. So that was the story really of, of that night he died, really. Chris obviously was called to come home from work, and he was struggling through the traffic to come home, and a policeman stopped him in this doorway and said, "You can't come here, it's a crime scene." And he said, "I want to see my son." He said, "You can't come in here, it's a crime scene." And that's the first I sort of was like, what do you mean crime scene? So Chris said to Dr. Day that day, he said he had his MMR 10 days ago. Would that have done it? And instantly he said no, it wouldn't be the MMR. And then the Mediced was mentioned. I'd given him Mediced, and he never said no to that. He said, well, we'll have to look into things. So, and as the case proceeds, they looked into Mediced more, the child's medicine you could buy over the counter in the chemist, to a vaccination that have got very bad ingredients in it.
Since 1986, there have been more than $4 billion, with a B, $4 billion US, paid out to parties who've experienced a vaccine injury. So what that act of 1986 did was give the pharmaceutical industry complete liability protection for their dirty, faulty products, set up a system, a kangaroo court that ostensibly is supposed to pay for vaccine injuries, and less than 25% of people who actually go through that court get any sort of compensation at all.
You know, he was really, really healthy. George was so, you know, bouncy, wild, healthy, young toddler. Nothing wrong with him whatsoever. Anyway, we came home, and as the day, you know, Chris was obviously on his computer looking at things and, you know, researching things, and the more we read, the more we looked into, the more it pointed to the MMR.
And another part of that law that's really important to consider, and it was set up a couple of years later, was the vaccine injury compensation system, essentially. There's another acronym for it, but what it is it's a special government court that has special rules, and it's paid for by actually taxpayers, or more specifically, there's a 75-cent tax placed on every vaccine sale. So the people that risk getting injured or who are injured are actually paying for that court to adjudicate these claims and pay out compensation. So the thing about this is it's hidden, it's not publicly available, and it has very restrictive rules. And, you know, it's hard to find out about this even existing because, you know, in my training as a doctor, I was never told about this at all.
No, what was tragic about the situation was many of the parents, like us, we'd fought to get legal aid, and you can only take on the pharmaceutical industry if you can get legal aid. Financially, you've no other way to do it. So we'd fought to get legal aid, and we'd had legal aid for virtually 10 years. But 6 months before the cases were due to go before the High Courts properly, to be individually investigated, legal aid was stopped. And that was in the autumn of 2003, just 6 months before we were due to go, even though we'd had legal aid repeatedly accepted.
The US government has paid out more than $4 billion in injury compensation claims to injured parties.
George 100% died of that vaccination. You know, there's not a doubt in my mind that he died of anything else bar that vaccination. And believe me, I was the mother that would not accept it in the beginning. But you know, the research we done, the more we researched, the more we done, the more it was that vaccination that did it.
The unrelenting virus may have met its match. Pfizer now says its vaccine is 95% effective and safe. The data just days away from being submitted to the FDA.
2 vaccines, each with 95% efficacy, rivaling the 98% efficacy of our measles vaccine.
And of course, we hope that we'll also have a COVID vaccination program alongside that, and the arrangements are being put in place for the NHS to deliver that.
You have to consider this vaccine being experimental because of this accelerated timeline, no conclusive proof, no long-term safety studies, and is based on an entirely new vaccine technology that's never been approved or deployed before.
Well, my understanding is that there are serious problems and have been a lot of difficulties trying to create a vaccine for the coronavirus. And it's not that they haven't tried, they have. What they have found from the research that I've done is that when they create a vaccine for a coronavirus, they seem to be okay initially, but when the person then encounters that virus in the wild, then it can result in a lot of real severe illness for people.
The whole push forward on this COVID-19 vaccine, or the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, which is really the appropriate name for it, it's a vaccine against a virus named SARS-CoV-2, and we use SARS-CoV-2, the name of the virus, synonymous with COVID-19, which is the syndrome that this virus ostensibly causes.
This whole movement towards demanding a vaccine, I believe, is part of a control system that I think this has been planned out for a long time myself, and I think this is part of a system of control that they want to install in this world where you won't be able to travel, you won't be able to go anywhere, you won't be able to buy anything unless you have this vaccine.
People who have tested positive for coronavirus and who have isolated themselves for 2 weeks could be offered a so-called freedom pass for at least 90 days, which would allow them to return to normal life.
And this untested vaccine, I think they're going to put it out on the market as soon as they can, and then you'll have a vaccine passport or something that says you've received it. But I think that there will be a lot of problems with it, and I wouldn't recommend it myself.
The vaccine is to prevent the virus from causing the COVID-19, and it's terrifying to me that they are pushing this vaccine forward at all. They've been trying to develop a coronavirus vaccine since 2002, when we had SARS as a pandemic in 2002. That was a cousin to the current coronavirus that is in circulation, causing the current pandemic. They've been trying for over 20 years to develop a vaccine, which they cannot do because this RNA vaccine is inserting just a small snip of the genetic material from the virus.
25% of common colds are coronaviruses, and we haven't managed to make an effective vaccine against the common cold in 70 years of trying. So I don't know how we're going to suddenly make one now. Although part of me wonders whether we're worried about making an effective vaccine, whether or not what we just need is a vaccine. Because we've already bought 30 million of one type of vaccine and 100 million of another type of vaccine, and we don't even know what it does. We've missed out the animal studies.
Well, I mean, I think one really important consideration is that it's a total shift in how we look at human rights and fundamental rights and freedoms.
You won't be able to buy or sell, you won't be able to travel, etc. if you don't have this vaccine. I think it's going to come to that. I think it's going to be forced on the world.
You know, after World War II, right, we had these trials and then we had drafting of the Nuremberg Code. And this was a major, shift because I think the world wanted to prevent future genocide and that we witnessed in World War II.
Hermann Wilhelm Goering, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the tribunal sentences you to death by hanging.
One of the things we're going to have no long-term studies, and the thing is also with a coronavirus anyway that rapidly mutates, there's going to be no vaccine that's going to be any good next year compared to this year.
And so one of the very important principles is that you cannot conduct scientific experiments on individuals without their express consent.
What the government is doing is it's hedging its bets. It's buying a lot of doses of vaccine now from 3 different manufacturers, 3 different processes involved to try and find one that works.
Anything that is developed for this COVID-19 umbrella is protected by the 2005 PrEP Act, which stands for the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, which was passed in 2005, which takes the 1986 Injury Compensation Act and puts it on steroids. Because if people get this vaccine, and now they're projecting that they need at least 2, maybe 3 doses of this vaccine, and they have any sort of any sort of injury whatsoever, the injured party or the relative of the dead party that dies from these vaccines, their only recourse is to form a class action lawsuit and approach the U.S. Attorney General and convince the U.S. Attorney General that these vaccines were made under an act of willful misconduct, meaning that the pharmaceutical industry knew that it was making something that was harmful, and they made it to intentionally harm people.
there's never been a commercially available retrovirus RNA vaccine that's ever been brought to market. Moderna, who is the bankrupt company that was $1.5 billion in the hole, that was propped up by Bill Gates, that Fauci has earmarked as the golden child, if you will. They have planned on this retrovirus RNA virus, and remember what RNA does. RNA repairs DNA. It goes in and repairs DNA. So now we're going to introduce a substance into the body that has the design of changing the morphological integrity of our DNA.
Because the one thing we know about these vaccines at the moment is that they will prevent illness due to SARS-CoV-2, due to the COVID-19 virus, as diagnosed by PCR.
You know, they just don't care. Nobody cares, you know. It's got to be all about money, hasn't it? What's it all about? What is all this about, damaging our children? What is their aim? You know, because they do know it's damaging our children. Why don't they change? Why don't they start saying, why don't more doctors start standing up and saying, you know, they'd get, I mean, if doctors started standing up, were they going to sack all the doctors? And get rid of all the doctors and all the specialists and all the scientists? Are they going to get rid of all them? No, they can't get rid of them all. They're going to have to start listening to them.
It pleases me that finally we're getting some real stories out there, and we're getting some truths that are coming out. People are doing some great journalism and exposing the truth as to where vaccines originated from. And it's a very, very long story, and it's a very, very corrupt story.
We are using their information to come to our conclusions, and we have beat them hands down on every single one of their arguments.
But there are days where I can't handle it. There are days where I, you know, see in the comments, especially on social media, and I do try to make people aware, but I have been attacked and I have been vilified. I've been banned from pages for fear-mongering parents, or even suggesting that there might be a correlation with their child's symptoms to the vaccination that they've just had.
We have won this argument hands down, and quite frankly, the powers that be, the only thing that they have left to argue against is character assassination, name-calling, and mud-slinging.
You sometimes wonder if you're actually making a dent. But then there are other times where I wake up and I'm a warrior, and I'll get to it, and yeah, it's amazing how many people just don't want to hear it.
The bottom line is informed consent. The doctors need to be able to answer people's concerns, and that means they have to have information about the trial process. They have to know what results have happened, true results, because sometimes you read a report and the conclusion doesn't match the content of the data.
It's only like you say, the parent stories, getting it out there, you know, shouting it from the rooftops. I mean, I'd be the first one marching the streets, you know. I have got a poster of my son, you know, a big poster of my son that I would go and roam the streets with. Do you know what? And I've almost gone to town and stood on my soapbox with my son's sign to warn parents to look into it. Don't just do what you're told to do. Look into it. This is what happened to my son and 1,000 other children.
So informed consent is the basis. Also treating the public as grown-ups. Give them accurate data.
It's very difficult to try and get the right information in order to be able to make that informed choice. The whole thing just needs to come crashing down. The whole pharmaceutical industry, the power it holds, the fact that they don't have any liability. If we were to change that law tomorrow, the pharmaceutical companies would go out of business within, I would say, 6 months.